Let's spend a few minutes today looking at what we'll call 5 sermons of Jesus. Scholars in general claim there are 5 discourses or sermons in the book of Matthew that Jesus gave. They are called like the Sermon on the Mount, number 1, very familiar one. A missionary discourse is one of them. Parabolic discourse, a discourse on the church, and a discourse on the end of times. These are the 5 discourses of Jesus in Matthew. Well, the Sermon on the Mount, again, very familiar, but it's Matthew 5-7. Often teach little kids, look at all the red letters in the Bible, from Jesus talking all the way from Matthew 5 through Matthew 7. But you'll recall things in those chapters like the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, some calling it a model prayer, talks of divorce, talks of lust and worldliness in his Sermon on the Mount, talks about persecution that they will face, how to pray, and about false prophets. And here's an interesting thing. And it was so in Matthew 7:28-29, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And this phrase, when he had finished these sayings, is one of the things scholars use to say, look, he's finished these sayings. And here was one of his sermons or end of a discourse. So that's pretty interesting. So as we continue on in our study, we see the missionary discourse, and this is in Matthew 10. Matthew 10, it's aimed towards the 12 apostles. That's who he's talking to. It talks about them traveling and being aware of opposition as they go out and not to be afraid. And so as that one wraps up, it's Matthew 11:1, and it came to pass when Jesus had finished commanding his 12 disciples that he departed from there to teach and to preach in their cities. So he's ending that discourse. And we move on and we get to what they call the parabolic discourse. In Matthew 13, where this is located, and the first part, he is outside giving a lesson, if you will, and it has the sower, the tares, the one about the mustard seed, talks about leaven, and then as it goes on, it continues, he's in a house. It says there's the hidden treasure, the pearl, about drawing the net in his parabolic discourse. And it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables in Matthew 13, verse 53, that he departed from there. So he's finished again another discourse or set of lessons. Then the discourse on the church, we see this in Matthew chapter 18. Matthew 18 talks about the lost sheep, unforgiving servant, talks about binding and loosing, talks about humility, and about self-sacrifice. And so when he wraps that one up, he says in Matthew 19:1, it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee, came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And moving on, the discourse on the end of times. And if you're a Bible student, you might be thinking ahead a little about what chapter that is, around Matthew 23-25, discourse on the end of times. And Matthew 24, it's called like the Olivet Discourse. Some break it down a little further, and they had questions about the end of times, about the destruction of the temple, about the second coming of Christ. And there's confusion in Bible students about which topics he's talking about. Does he switch topics here and things? But we believe he's talking of 2 different questions that were asked. 2 different questions were asked. In Matthew 26, verses 1 and 2, it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he said to disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. So pretty much his last discourse right there. So in summary, the 5 discourses, Sermon on the Mount again, the missionary discourse, the parabolic discourse, discourse on the church, and discourse on the end of times. I hope you at least enjoy having that knowledge of how some break Jesus' sermons down in the book of Matthew.